Good morning. That should be easy to follow. Is this on? Do I have to push anything? We're good to go? Great. Thank you. That was inspiring and astonishing, and I was totally unprepared for that. That was fabulous. I have known that song for decades, and that just put a whole other twist on things. So, as I'm organizing myself here. So, where do I want to begin? I want to begin with a meditation that I have been sitting with all week. But it kind of comes from just kind of where we are right now. You know, we're in this in-between space, right? We don't know if we're going forward or we're stepping back again. Last month I was here. We were live streaming, and y'all weren't in the community. Hopefully you were in the Webernet somewhere there. And we're moving, we're making plans that maybe they're going to happen, maybe they won't happen. It's just kind of calling us all to stay agile. So I've been thinking of these words from George Santayana. George Santayana was a 20th century essayist. He was a philosopher, historian. But he says this. He says, skepticism is chastity for the intellect. Let's sit with that a second. Skepticism is chastity for the intellect. Because to be chaste is to hold back before one gives oneself. And skepticism acts very much the same way. That we just don't jump into something or just sort of give ourselves away. You know, no one wants to become intellectually pregnant on the first date. There's a sense of waiting. But here's the thing, is that the virtue of chastity is not chastity, because that leads to barrenness. The virtue of chastity is to wait until one knows they're ready to give themselves. And the same thing with skepticism. The virtue of skepticism isn't simply to be skeptical, but to observe, to question, to pay attention, because otherwise skepticism can lead to cynicism. And cynicism has a form of calcification of the mind, right? It's stuck. When we find ourselves cynical, we are no longer open to amazement or surprise or wonder. We cease the ability to be agile or novel. We are stuck in the past. We're very much like Lot's wife, right? Our attention is so much focused on what is behind us that we're unable to move forward. So yes, we should be skeptical of what's going on. We should question what's going on. But at the same point, we don't want to stay stuck in that area, right? We want to be able to remain agile in one way. And that's kind of what I want to be talking about this morning, because it's really about, you know, this idea of God's love for us, and for us to see that divine love within ourselves. And it's kind of interesting, I think, that February traditionally seems to be Love Month, and it's all kind of focused, I think, around, you know, Valentine's Day, which to my partner, I always say that Valentine's Day is amateur night, and I'm always in trouble because, you know, I mean, I don't like to be coerced. And I don't like to be coerced by companies that want me to buy things like diamonds, chocolates. I mean, I'm good with chocolate, but you know, This idea that I'm supposed to do it, because that's not what love is, isn't it? And it's again, as we look into the starry world and we see we are now in the season of the water bearer, right? That water that is pouring upon the earth, refreshing it, so there's a sense of togetherness in this. And then we move into the sign of the fishes, which is really about dissolving boundaries and allowing ourselves to go into the depths of experiences. So it's right to give it into love. And what I want to offer about love, because that's what I really want to talk about today, is something that Dante Alighieri, the entire Divine Comedy is about love, but it's about two types of love, what he calls the ordinate and disordinate love. Because in the Inferno, which is the first part of love, of the comedy, when I was reading that this year again, what I got was there's like madness in the Inferno, because it's about loving the wrong things. It's about what Dante teaches in the Divine Comedy is something very interesting that I've been sitting with for the last several months, and it is this: time is love. Time is love, because what we spend our time with is what we truly love. And what we love, we become. So if we spend our time giving love, that strong affection towards something that is anchored in time, we will go mad. What we understand as metaphysicians is we're not so concerned about a physical hell or heaven, a place to go when we're dead. The idea of our spirituality is not sort of a post-mortem travel agency, but it's about how to live in the here and now. And then there's Purgatorio, right? And that is loving the right thing wrongly. And we all know what that means, right? It's about how we want it our way and what we want to do with it. And let me give you an example. It's one of my favorite stories from the Arthurian myths. It's the story of Dame Ragno. Do y'all know the story of Dame Ragno? It's one of my favorites. So Dame Ragno she was actually the sister of one of the Knights of the Round Table. And it said that she was gracious and elegant and giving and kind, wise and beautiful. But as happens in most legends and myths, she angered somebody, a witch who cursed her. And the curse was this, is that she was transformed into a beast. It is said she had tusks like a boar, and that her breath smelled like a swamp, and that her hair was stringy and scraggly, and she was large and cumbersome and breathed heavily. She was offensive to all. And so as these stories go, sure enough, Arthur had gotten himself into trouble again of one form or another, and a riddle was the only thing that was going to get him out of it. And no one knew the answer to the riddle except Dame Ragnar. And so she was approached, and she said, yeah, I'll give you the answer, but here's the deal. I want a wedding. And I don't want some Vegas wedding. I want the full thing. I want the whole shooting match of how this goes. And so everybody was like, oh, no. So Gawain, good old Gawain, Sir Gawain, one of the noblest of them, he says, I'll do it. You got me, I'm in. So, of course, she gives the answer to the riddle. Arthur is saved once again. Everything is going fine, and now it's the wedding day. And of course, it's the full splendor of a wedding with all these things. And out trumps Dame Ragnar, and everybody's like, what's with this guy? So here's the deal. It's the wedding night, and they're in the bridal chamber getting ready to do what happens on the wedding night in the bridal chamber. And Dame Ragnar says, well, let me go slip into something more comfortable. And she comes out and she's stunning. She is herself, the beauty, the grace, the elegance. And she says, here's the deal. I live under a curse. And part of my life is spent as you have seen me before, and part of my life is how you see me today. And here's the deal. I can be who you see now privately, in which case my public image will be what was there. Or I can be who you see me now publicly, and then privately, this is what you get. What do you want to do? And there's Gawain's thing, right? And so think about that. What would you do if you were Gawain? So Gawain says this: I'm going to let you choose. I'm going to give you the sovereignty of this choice. And by giving Dame Ragno back her sovereignty, the curse is broken, and she is restored to the fullness of who she is. So that's the power of love. Love, of course, is a strong emotion. But it is a strong emotion in which we give to the object of our love its full sovereignty. We love it into its timelessness, its freedom. We know this in spiritual community. We call it loving each other into wholeness, or as my teacher used to say, growing up all over each other. But what it does is it leads us to this idea that, we live in an unfinished universe, which by very definition of unfinished is imperfect, which means we live in a universe that is more paradoxical than not. And so how do we live and how do we love in this paradox? So Parker Palmer says it this way. He says, the deeper our faith, the more doubt we must endure. The deeper our hope, the more prone we are to despair. The deeper our love, the more pain its loss will bring. These are a few of the paradoxes that we must hold as human beings. And there's another paradox that I want to offer to consider this morning, and that is this, is we are told, I was told, you really can't love another person until you love yourself. We've all heard that, right? But here's the deal. How can you give what you've never received? Because how can we truly love ourselves unless we have been loved? And so, it's kind of like what Carl Jung says, where he says you can only take people as far as you've gone yourself. Ernest Holmes says it in the sense where he says we see the condition outside and we heal it on the inside. Henri Nouwen, who is a priest and a philosopher and a theologian, says it this way. He says, the great illusion of leadership is to think that a man can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there. So, how do we love ourselves if we've never been loved? Well, of course, we can get all metaphysical and say, well, that God loves me. Well, if you've never been loved, what in the world does that mean? And it feels like nothing but magical thinking. I think that's the beauty of spiritual community. As I look out here this morning, as I think about the community that I serve in, it is an interesting and diverse, quirky group of people. And yet, when we walk in the door of a community such as ours, we are loved into wholeness. And if we are wise, we give each other the sovereignty of their own life. Another way of saying it is this, is if we say that we are made in the image and likeness of the divine, then that means that everybody here, I would venture to say everything here, not just because of people, but plants and birds and trees and all that other stuff, is the image of God. So whenever we look askance at that one, we are looking askance at the image of the divine. Whenever we hold a judgment or a thought, we are holding a judgment or a thought about the image of God. Whenever, the issue with spiritual community, and I've been in it a long time, there's spiritual and religious. I'm kind of in the religious camp because it's what I do for a living. But this is what I know about spiritual communities, is most of the conversation that takes place in a spiritual community is how we're not like those people. Oh, we're tolerant, all right. But tolerant is kind of a colonial mentality because we're still right. We become cynical, calcified. If we are looking at the image and likeness of God, we should be ready. We should call forth amazement, surprise, wonder, openness to novelty, and to where it will lead us and what's available. When we are in spiritual communities such as this, we are given back our sovereignty. So my question this morning, or one of the questions that I have this morning for you this morning is where do you receive that sovereignty? Where are you loved? And hopefully, you can answer that. And hopefully, one of those places is the community that you belong to. Because the next question is, where do you love? Where do you give sovereignty? We are, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin says, we are the heart and the mind of a living planet. Kurt Vonnegut says it better. He says, we are the mud that got to get up and look around. Lucky us, lucky mud. However, we are the heart and mind. And if the mind is whole, the body is whole. If the heart is filled with light, the body is filled with light. If we look at what's happening in the world today and all the situations that are going on, it is because it's a systems issue, right? It's because the mind is disturbed. The mind has gone mad collectively because it's loving the wrong things, like greed, or it's loving the right things wrongly. I'm right. So what if we can shift and change that? And so this is really where, when we feel comfortable, when we feel loved, when we are given our sovereignty, then we can make our way into the more interesting aspects of what it means to be fully alive, fully present, fully in the career of this thing called life. There's an author that I love a lot, and she has passed untimely. Her name was Rachel Held Evans. And I love her writings. I love her books. She recently, her friends published a book of hers after she passed a couple years ago called Wholehearted Faith. And she says this. She says, to love oneself well is to regard one's place in the world with candor and grace, grounded in a humble realization of one's strengths, as well as a clear-eyed understanding of one's weaknesses. To love oneself well is to be able to distinguish between what one wants and what one needs. To love oneself well means not to diminish the beautiful creature that God has made, nor to cultivate an outside image of that same person. So here's our practice, is to reflect. Ernest Holmes gives us this great mantra, this great affirmation, where he says, and we should say, and I say this throughout the day, I am a center of divine consciousness within the vast whole. I am a center of divine consciousness within the vast whole. Thank you, Ernest. So, as a center of divine consciousness, do I know my strengths, your weaknesses, our weaknesses? Do we know the difference between what we want and what we need, and what motivates those? Can we embrace the divinity, the beauty, the novelty, the sovereignty of who we are? Or are we trying to create a toxic mimic, a caricature? You, I, are centers of divine consciousness within this vast whole. And we come together weekly, daily, whatever and how long it takes, to remind ourselves of that. To give each other our sovereignty and to receive from others our sovereignty. To love the timeless, which is the divine, and not be bound and give our time to that which is passing, which can only lead to madness. So there you have it, kids. Thank you for your kind attention.